My name is Whitney Ardmore. I'm 34 years old. 11 days after we buried my father, my stepmother held an estate sale in the house I grew up in and tried to sell my dead mother's china to the neighbors. She had already burned the rest. The dresses, the photographs, the recipe cards in my mother's handwriting. She did all of it the morning after the funeral while I was driving back from the cemetery. What Joanne didn't know was that my mother had spent the last 14 months of her life writing letters and hiring a lawyer in Indianapolis named Bob Halvorson, and one of those letters had been sitting inside the family Bible at Psalm 91 since August of 1996. I'm Whitney Ardmore. I'm 34. I'm a hospice nurse in Greenfield, Indiana, which means I sit with dying people for a living, and I have learned something most people don't want to know: the dying plan more carefully than the living give them credit for. My mother knew that. My mother used every single day she had left. Before I tell you what happened the afternoon Bob Halvorson pulled up to that estate sale in his old Buick, I want to say this. If stories like this find you at the right moment, subscribe. I share a new one every night, quietly, for people who already know what it's like to be the one nobody listened to. And drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back to the summer I was 7, when my mother said something to me on the back porch that I didn't understand until I was 34. It was August of 1996. My mother was 41 years old and dying of ovarian cancer, though I didn't know the word ovarian yet, and I only half understood the word dying. She had been a second-grade teacher at Greenfield Central Elementary for 16 years. She graded papers with a green felt-tip pen because she said red pen made children feel like they'd been bleeding all over the page. She kept a little jar of butterscotch candies on her desk at school, and when I was small enough to sit on her lap, I used to unwrap them one at a time and feed them to her between essays. By that August, she couldn't stand long enough to teach. Her hair was gone. She wore a pale blue cotton scarf around her head, the same color as the stationery she used for everything. We sat on the back porch most evenings because the house got too warm in the afternoons, and the doctor had told her fresh air would help her appetite. It didn't help her appetite. Nothing helped her appetite. But she liked sitting out there with me, listening to the cicadas come up out of the field behind our house. She had a leather-bound King James Bible on her lap that whole summer. Not because we were a particularly religious family. My father went to church on Easter and Christmas, and that was the extent of it, but because the Bible had belonged to her mother, my grandmother Adele, who died in 1991. My mother used to fold things into it. Receipts, photographs, a pressed daisy from the day she married my father in 1985, a holy card from her own mother's funeral, a grocery list from a Thursday morning that nobody else would ever care about. She kept it on the kitchen counter most days, between the sugar canister and the phone, like it was a recipe box for things that mattered. She did other things that summer that I only understood later. She organized the linen closet by color. She wrote out the recipe for her mother's chicken and noodles on an index card and put it in the front of the recipe box. She labeled photographs in our family albums with little white stickers. The year, the place, who was in the picture, going all the way back to her own childhood in Knightstown. She had me sit with her at the kitchen table one afternoon while she walked me through every drawer in the house, telling me what was in it, like a tour guide. I thought she was bored. I thought it was something cancer made you do. I understand now she was making a record. She was building a map. She was leaving instructions for somebody who didn't exist yet, for a 35-year-old woman she would never meet. That August evening on the back porch, she handed me a butterscotch candy and said, "Whit, I want you to know something." She had a way of saying my name like it was the most serious word in the language. Some letters wait 30 years for the right hand to open them. Do you know what that means? I shook my head. I was 7. She smiled at me. It means I love you so much, I'm going to keep loving you even after I can't be here. And one day, when you need it, the love is going to show up exactly when you need it. Not before, not after, right when. I didn't know what to say to that. I asked her if I could have another butterscotch. She laughed. She said, "You can have all the butterscotch in the jar." She died on October 8th, 1996. I was 7 years and 4 months old. My father held it together long enough to bury her in the family plot at Park Cemetery in Greenfield. After that, he stopped holding it together. He drank for about 2 years. He drank Old Crow out of a mason jar most nights at the kitchen table because he couldn't bring himself to use her wedding glasses. He missed parent-teacher conferences. He fell asleep in the recliner with the TV on. He stopped opening mail. The neighbors brought casseroles for a while, and then they stopped because nothing they brought ever came back as a clean dish. He stopped drinking when his sister, my Aunt Maris, drove down from Fort Wayne and told him she would take me to live with her if he didn't get sober. He got sober. He stayed sober. But the man who came back was quieter than the man my mother had married. He was a man who had learned to need somebody to tell him what to do next. That somebody was Joanne Bricker, who he met at a Lions Club fundraiser in the spring of 2001 and married in October of the same year. Joanne was 38 and had a son my age named Cody from her first marriage. She moved into our house on Mulberry Drive, and she did not waste any time making it her house. The first weekend she lived with us, she boxed up my mother's clothes and put them in the attic. I was 12. I didn't know how to fight her on it. My father didn't either. I'm going to tell you something true about Joanne, and I want you to hear it the way I would say it at my kitchen table. Joanne is not a cartoon villain. She didn't come into our lives planning to destroy anything. She was a woman who had grown up jealous of women like my mother, who was loved easily, and she had spent her whole life being the second choice, and she married a widower whose dead wife the whole town still missed, and that is a hard thing to do. I understand that. I have understood that since I was old enough to read people, which in my profession is something you learn fast. But understanding why Joanne was the way she was did not change what she did. For 23 years, every time I came home from college, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every summer visit, Joanne moved one more piece of my mother out of the house. The framed picture of my mother in her teaching robes. Gone. The Pyrex casserole dish my mother got at her bridal shower in 1985. Gone. Replaced with a Joanne dish. My mother's recipe box with the green felt pen handwriting moved to the basement, then the garage, then I don't know where. Every visit was a quiet inventory. Every visit I noticed one more thing missing, and every visit I told myself I'd ask my father about it next time, and every next time I didn't. Because by then he was a man who flinched when his wife raised her voice, and I didn't want to make his life harder. Let me give you a few of those moments, because they are the ones that built up like silt in a riverbed, and you don't notice silt until you can't get the boat through anymore. The summer of 2005, I was 15. I came home from a week at church camp and the back porch had been repainted. Not the paint job, the floorboards. The original wood floor where my mother had sat with me in 1996 had been ripped up and replaced with composite decking. Joanne said, "Honey, that wood was rotting. We had to replace it for safety." It was not rotting. I had walked on it 3 weeks earlier. But I was 15 and I didn't have a leg to stand on with a 42-year-old stepmother who had just spent $4,000 on composite decking, so I didn't say anything. I went up to my room and I sat on the bed and I cried for about 10 minutes, and then I came down for dinner and ate macaroni and cheese. The Christmas of 2010, I was 21 and home from Ball State for break. Joanne had repainted the dining room. The wallpaper my mother had picked out in 1992, a soft yellow with little blue flowers, was gone. In its place was a beige paint with a faux finish sponge effect that was already out of style by 2010. Joanne said, "Sweetie, that wallpaper made the room look so dated. I think you'll come to love this." I did not come to love it. My father stood in the doorway looking at the new walls, and his face had this look that I have seen on the faces of dying patients. The look of a man watching something he loved disappear and not knowing how to stop it. The Easter of 2015, I was 26 and dating a man who would later become not the right man, but at the time I thought he might be. I brought him home for Easter dinner. Joanne had gotten my mother's good silverware out. The silverware my grandmother Adele had given my mother as a wedding present in 1985, and she was using it like it was hers. The B engraved on the handles, for Bricker, made no sense because Bricker was Joanne's first husband's last name, not my mother's name and not my father's name. I didn't say anything at dinner. After dinner, when I was washing dishes, Joanne came up behind me and said very sweetly, "Whitney, I noticed you noticing the silverware. I had it re-engraved last year. Such a small thing, but it makes me feel like the lady of the house." I looked at her. I said, "It's lovely, Joanne." Because what else was I going to say? The Thanksgiving of 2019, my father had a small stroke. Nothing serious. He recovered. But while he was in the hospital, Joanne went through every closet in the house and tidied up. When I came home that weekend, my mother's wedding dress was no longer in the garment bag in my old closet. Joanne said, "Sweetie, I had it cleaned and I'm storing it in the basement so it doesn't get yellowed." I went down to the basement and I could not find it. I asked her 3 more times that weekend. She had 3 different answers. The third answer was, "Whitney, I don't have time for this conversation today. I'm trying to take care of your father." That was the moment I knew the dress was gone. I just didn't know yet how she had gotten rid of it. Joanne's tone was always polite. That was the worst part. She never said anything ugly to me directly. She said things like, "Sweetie, your mother had such old-fashioned taste. I think it's time we updated some of these things." Or, "Honey, that recipe box was getting moldy. I had to throw it out for everyone's health." Or my favorite, the one she said to me at Christmas of 2019, holding my mother's pale blue silk scarf in her hands, the one I'd been planning to ask my father about. "Whitney, you're a grown woman now. We don't need to keep every little thing a person ever owned, do we?" I said. "I'd like that scarf, Joanne." She said, "I already gave it to Goodwill, sweetheart. It was sitting in a drawer. Things should be used." I drove back to my apartment that night and sat in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes before I went upstairs. I didn't cry. I just sat there. I had a Honda Civic with 180,000 miles on it and a Panera bag on the passenger seat, and I sat there thinking, she will not stop until there is nothing left. What I didn't know was that my mother had already thought of that. My father got his diagnosis in February of 2024. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, which in my line of work is a sentence I have learned to translate for families. That's 6 months on the high end, 3 months in the middle, sometimes less. He made it 10 months. I want to tell you about those 10 months because they matter to what came after. I drove down from Indianapolis every weekend. I sat with him on the back porch, the new porch, the composite decking, and I read to him from old Reader's Digest issues he had saved from the 80s. I helped him into the shower when he got too weak to do it himself. I administered his pain medication on a schedule because Joanne, for all her wifely posturing, could not stand to be in the room when he was hurting. The thing I noticed in those 10 months was that my father started talking about my mother again. He hadn't talked about her in 23 years. Not really. Not the way you talk about somebody you've loved. Joanne would not allow it. But as he got weaker, and as the morphine dose increased, his guard started coming down, and one afternoon in October he looked at me from the recliner and he said, "Whit, your mother used to listen to Patsy Cline while she folded laundry. Did you know that?" I said. "I knew that, Daddy." He said, "She had this little radio on the dryer, the one with the antenna." I said, "I remember." He said, "I should have kept that radio." I said, "It's okay." He said, "No, Whit. It's not. I should have kept a lot of things." He died at home on a Tuesday morning in early December, with Joanne in the kitchen and me holding his hand. The last thing he said to me was my mother's name. He said, "Nell." Just that, Nell. The funeral was on a Saturday. We buried him next to my mother in the same plot at Park Cemetery, the way he'd asked. The reception was at the church. Joanne wore a black dress with a brooch I had never seen before, a heavy gold leaf-shaped thing, and she stood at the door and accepted condolences like a queen at a state funeral. Cody was there. He's 34 too, same as me, and he's a decent enough person, an HVAC tech in Cincinnati with 2 kids, but he has spent his whole life trying not to disappoint his mother, and the result is that he has disappointed almost everyone else. He hugged me at the reception and told me he was sorry. I believed him. I drove back to the cemetery alone after the reception because I wanted to sit at my parents' graves for a few minutes without anyone watching me. I sat there in the cold, in the brown loafers I'd bought specifically for the funeral, and I told my dad I was going to be okay, and I told my mom I missed her every single day, and then I drove back to the house on Mulberry Drive at about 4:30 in the afternoon. I knew something was wrong before I opened the front door because I could smell it from the driveway. Smoke. Not fireplace smoke. Something else. Something sharper. Joanne had a fire going in the backyard burn barrel. She was wearing the same black dress with a Carhartt jacket over it, and she had a long stick in her hand, and she was poking things into the flames. From the porch, I could see what she was burning: a photo album. The blue one with the gold corners, the one with my mother's wedding pictures. A cardboard box of letters. A stack of recipe cards tied with a rubber band. A stuffed bear my mother had given me when I was 4 that I had left in my old bedroom for sentimental reasons. I said, "Joanne, what are you doing?" She looked up at me and she did not even look guilty. She said, "Whitney, sweetheart, I'm finally clearing out the things that have been weighing this house down. Your father wanted me to do this. He told me before he passed." I said, "He did not tell you that." She said, "Honey, you weren't here for those last conversations. He and I talked about a lot of things. I know it's hard to hear, but he wanted a fresh start for me. He didn't want me living in a museum. I want you to understand what she was saying." She was telling me that the dying man whose hand I had been holding for 10 months had asked her, not me, to burn his first wife's belongings. It was such a clean lie. It was the kind of lie a person tells when they have rehearsed it. I walked past her into the house. The whole first floor smelled like smoke. The hutch in the dining room was empty. Every piece of my mother's china was sitting on the dining table with little white price stickers on them. Stickers with her own handwriting on them. $5, $8, $1.50 for the gravy boat. There was a folding sign by the front door that said "E-State Sale, this Saturday 9 to 4. The date on the sign was 11 days from then. I went upstairs to my old bedroom. The closet was empty. My mother's wedding dress, which had been hanging there in a garment bag for 28 years because she had wanted me to have the option of wearing it someday, was gone. The hope chest at the foot of the bed was open and empty. The only thing left in the room was the leather King James Bible on the nightstand where my father had kept it since 1996. I picked up the Bible. I sat on the edge of the bed. I opened it. I am going to tell you something. I had picked up that Bible probably 50 times in my life. Every time I came home, I'd see it on his nightstand and I'd touch it because it had been my grandmother's and then my mother's, and now it was just sitting there. I had never opened it. I don't know why. Maybe because I wasn't religious. Maybe because grief makes you afraid of certain objects. That afternoon, I opened it. I let it fall open on its own, the way old books do, and it fell open to Psalm 91. And folded inside Psalm 91, on pale blue stationery the same color as the scarf my mother used to wear, was a letter. Have you ever had to stay silent to protect yourself, even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. The letter was dated August 12, 1996. The handwriting was my mother's, and even 30 years later, I knew it the way you know a face. Slightly slanted, loops on the Y's, greens not blacks, even on stationery. She had written in her green felt pen. The letter said this. I'm going to tell you what it said because it matters to the rest of the story. It said, "Dear Whitney, if you are reading this, then you have lost your father, and I am so sorry. I had hoped you would not need this letter for a very long time, and I had hoped that by the time you did need it, you would be old enough to understand it. I think you are. I think if you are reading this, you are old enough." It said, "Your father is a good man, but he is not a strong one, and I have known for several months that after I'm gone he is going to need someone, and the someone he chooses will probably not love you the way I love you. That is not his fault. That is grief. But I cannot leave you unprotected." It said, "In the spring of 1995, when I was first diagnosed, I drove to Indianapolis and I hired an attorney named Robert Halverson of Halverson and Pike on Meridian Street. Bob is a good man. He took a photograph of you that I had brought with me, and he told me he would keep it on his desk until you were 35 years old, which was the age I asked him to hold this for. It said, I have set up an irrevocable trust in your name, funded with the settlement from my teacher's pension and the inheritance from your grandmother Adele. I will not tell you the amount in this letter because I don't want it to change how you think about me. But it is enough. The trust holds the deed to this house, Whitney. The house on Mulberry Drive. Your father has a life estate, which means he can live in it as long as he is alive, but the house itself belongs to you. It has belonged to you since 1995. It said, in the trust documents I have also included a clause that protects the contents of the house. Anything that belonged to me at the time of my death belongs to the trust. Furniture, photographs, clothing, the china my mother gave me, everything. I did this because I had a feeling, Whitney, and I am a woman who has learned to trust her feelings. I had a feeling that someday someone would try to erase me, and I wanted you to have a way to stop it. It said, call Bob Halvorson. The number is at the bottom of this letter. Tell him you are Eleanor Ardmore's daughter. He will know what to do. It said, I love you so much, Whit. I told you on the back porch that some letters wait 30 years for the right hand to open them. This is one of those letters. I hope you are okay. I hope you grew up to be the woman I always knew you would be. I am so sorry I could not be there for it. It was signed, Mama. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time. I don't know how long. Long enough that the smell of smoke from the backyard had stopped registering. Long enough that the daylight had shifted in the windows. I read the letter 3 times. I cried at the third reading, but quietly, because I have learned in my line of work that you can cry without making a sound when you need to. Then I picked up my phone and I called the number at the bottom of the letter. It was a 317 area code. Indianapolis. The phone rang 4 times, and then a woman with a kind voice answered. She said, Halvorson and Pike, this is Margaret. I said, my name is Whitney Ardmore. My mother was Eleanor Ardmore. I think Bob Halvorson has a file with my name on it. There was a pause, a real pause. Then Margaret said, honey, hold on 1 second. About 30 seconds later, a man got on the phone. He sounded older, not frail, just older. His voice was warm and slow and very Midwestern. He said, Whitney, this is Bob Halvorson. I've been waiting on this call for 30 years. I said, I know. I just opened the letter. He said, where are you right now? I said, I'm in my bedroom on Mulberry Drive in Greenfield. My stepmother is burning my mother's things in the backyard. There was another pause. Then he said very quietly, how soon can I drive to you? I said, how soon can you get here? He said, I'm 71 years old and I'd still got a license and an old Buick. I can be there in 3 hours. I said, there's an estate sale on Saturday. She's selling my mother's china to the neighbors. He said, Whitney, I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to answer it like a lawyer's daughter. Do you want me to come tonight and stop the burning, or do you want me to come Saturday and stop the sale? I sat with that question. I want you to understand what kind of question that was. He was asking me whether I wanted privacy or whether I wanted witnesses. He was asking me whether I wanted Joanne to be quietly informed in our living room or whether I wanted Joanne to be informed in front of every neighbor on Mulberry Drive, with my mother's china on the table and stickers in her own handwriting. I thought about my mother on the back porch. I thought about her saying, the love is going to show up exactly when you need it. I said, Saturday. Come Saturday. He said, I'll be there at 1 in the afternoon. And Whitney, I said, yes. He said, don't tell her. Not a word. Don't try to argue with her between now and then. Don't try to save anything else. She has already done what she's done. We are going to make sure she does not get to do any more of it. Do you understand? I said, yes. He said, your mother was the bravest person I ever met. I want you to know that. I said, thank you. I hung up the phone. I went downstairs. Joanne was in the kitchen, pulling saran wrap over a Pyrex dish of leftover funeral ham. She looked up at me and she said, Sweetie, are you spending the night? I made up the guest room. The master is mine now, of course. I said, I'll stay at a hotel, Joanne, thank you. She said, whatever's easiest. I drove to the Hampton Inn off I-70. I sat on the bed in my room with the lights off for about an hour, and then I called my Aunt Maris, my father's sister, and I told her everything. Aunt Maris is 68 years old and she has never been afraid of anybody in her life. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she said, Whit, I will be in Greenfield Friday night. I would not miss this for the world. Have you ever set a boundary and watched someone completely unravel because you stopped being convenient? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. Between Tuesday night and Saturday afternoon, I did exactly what Bob Halverson told me to do. Nothing. I went to work. I drove home from Greenfield to my apartment in Indianapolis. I sat with two of my hospice patients and held their hands while they passed. I did laundry. I drank coffee out of my chipped Pyrex mug, and I wrote a thank you note to my Aunt Maris because writing thank you notes is one of those things my mother taught me before she got sick, and I have never stopped doing it. On Wednesday afternoon, I stopped at the Hancock County Recorder's office on my lunch break, and I asked the clerk, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, to pull the deed for the property at 1184 Mulberry Drive in Greenfield. She found it in about 4 minutes. The deed had been transferred into the Eleanor Ardmore Family Trust on April 17, 1995. The clerk looked at me over her reading glasses and she said, Honey, this is a public record. Anybody could have looked this up at any time. I said, I know. I just wanted to see it with my own eyes. She said, I understand. On Thursday, Bob Halvorson called me twice. Once to confirm the estate sale time. Once to tell me that he had filed an emergency motion with Judge Marlene Hennessy of Hancock County Circuit Court to issue a court order halting any further dissipation of trust property. He said, She signed it this afternoon, Whitney. She read the inventory your mother prepared. She read it twice. She said, This is one of the most thorough trust documents she has ever seen come across her bench. Your mother was a teacher, but she had the mind of a lawyer. Joanne texted me twice. Once on Wednesday to ask if I wanted any of the costume jewelry before the sale. I did not respond. Once on Friday to remind me the sale was Saturday and to ask if I'd be coming by to say my goodbyes to the house. I texted back, I'll be there. That was all I said. Saturday morning, I drove to Greenfield in a calm I had not felt in 23 years. I picked up Aunt Maris from the Hampton Inn. She was wearing a wool coat the color of cranberries, and she had her hair done. And she got in my Honda and she said, Whit, we are going to a public event today, and we are going to behave like ladies, and we are going to let that woman hang herself with her own rope. I said, Yes, ma'am. She said, and I brought a thermos of coffee from Aunt Bea's. None of that Starbucks burnt bean nonsense. We pulled up to Mulberry Drive at 12:45. There were already cars parked along the street. The sign in the front yard had been updated. Estate, sale. Today 9 to 4. All items priced to move. The dining room table was covered in my mother's china. The hutch was empty. The credenza in the living room was empty. The wedding photo of my parents from 1985, gone. In its place was a framed wedding photo of Joanne and my father from 2001, which I had never seen displayed in that spot before. Joanne was at a card table by the front door with a metal cash box. She had hand-stamped tags on everything, and she was making small talk with a woman from down the street about how estate sales are just so emotionally exhausting, but it has to be done. Cody was there. He was helping. He looked up and saw me, and his face did this thing, a tightening around the eyes, like he knew something was going to happen and he was bracing for it. I have wondered since whether he knew about the burning. I think he probably did. I think he probably told his mother she shouldn't, and I think she probably did it anyway. There were probably 15 people in the house when Bob Halverson pulled up at 1 o'clock exactly. He came up the porch steps slowly. Brown loafers. A tan briefcase in his right hand. A gray suit that was a little too big in the shoulders, the way old men's suits get. He had to be 71, but he carried himself like a man who had been someone's favorite professor once. He stopped just inside the door and he scanned the room. His eyes landed on the dining room table, on the china. and something in his face shifted. Not anger, disappointment. Like a man watching something he had hoped wouldn't happen. Joanne saw him and immediately mistook him for a customer. She said, "Welcome, sir. Everything's priced to move. The china is $40 for the full set, but if you're interested in just a few pieces, I can do a la carte." Bob set his briefcase down on the card table, right next to her cash box. He said, "Ma'am, my name is Robert Halvorson. I'm an attorney with Halvorson and Pike in Indianapolis. I represent the Eleanor Ardmore Family Trust. I'm here on behalf of the trust's beneficiary." Joanne stared at him. She said, "I'm sorry, what?" Bob opened the briefcase. He took out a manila folder, very neat, the kind of folder a man who has been a lawyer since 1979 keeps. He took out a court order. He took out a notarized copy of the trust agreement, dated April of 1995. He took out an inventory list. "And Joanne, I want you to understand this. My mother had made a written inventory in 1996 of every item in that house that belonged to her, with descriptions and approximate values. Bob Halvorson had been holding that inventory for 30 years. He set the inventory on the table, right on top of the cash box. He said, "Ma'am, the contents of this house, as of October 8, 1996, are the property of the Eleanor Ardmore Family Trust. The estate sale you are conducting is unauthorized. The items currently for sale are trust property. I have a court order signed yesterday by Judge Marlene Hennessy of Hancock County Circuit Court directing the immediate cessation of this sale and the preservation of all remaining trust property." I watched her hand stop moving toward the cash box. The room had gone completely quiet. 15 people in a small living room and you couldn't hear a thing. Mrs. Ferguson from 2 doors down was holding a Pyrex casserole dish, my mother's casserole dish, and she had this look on her face, this little O of recognition. I saw Aunt Maris settle her weight back on her heels like she was watching the best show of her life. Joanne said, I don't understand. Robert and I are married. This is our house." Bob said, "Ma'am, with all due respect, your late husband had a life estate in this property. The deed has belonged to the trust since 1995. The trust's beneficiary is his daughter, Whitney Ardmore. She turned 35 on June 12th of this year, which triggered the full vesting of the trust assets, including the deed. As of June 12th, this house has been Whitney's. Your husband's death on December 3rd did not change that. It only ended his life estate." Joanne said, "But he didn't tell me." Bob said, "Ma'am, with respect, he may not have known. Eleanor Ardmore set this trust up in 1995. The deed was executed in April of that year. A copy was filed with the Hancock County Recorder's Office. It is a public record. It has been a public record for 30 years. Mrs. Ferguson, holding the casserole dish, said softly, "Wait, isn't this Nell's casserole?" That was the moment. That was the witness. That was the third party reacting first, exactly the way my mother must have known a third party would. Mrs. Ferguson had been my mother's friend in 1995. Mrs. Ferguson had eaten that casserole at our kitchen table. And now Mrs. Ferguson was looking at my stepmother with the slow, dawning expression of a woman realizing what was being sold. Joanne looked at the casserole dish like it was on fire. She said, "Ginny, that's just a..." Mrs. Ferguson set the casserole dish down on the table, very gently, and then she took 2 steps back from it. Bob said, "Ma'am, I need you to stop the sale. I need you to refund every transaction that has occurred today and return the items. I have a deputy from the sheriff's office sitting in his cruiser at the end of the driveway in case there is any difficulty." Joanne looked out the front window. The cruiser was there. White Hancock County paint, parked very politely against the curb. She said, I want to call my lawyer." Bob said, "You absolutely should. May I ask who represents you?" She didn't have one. I knew she didn't. She had assumed she would never need one. She said, "I'll need to find one." Bob said, "Take your time, ma'am. I'll wait. In the meantime, the sale is closed." Cody walked over to his mother. He said very quietly, "Mom, what did you do?" She turned on him. She said, "Cody, this is none of your concern. This is between me and Whitney." He said, "Mom, did you burn things?" She didn't answer. He said, Mom, did you burn Whitney's mother's things? She still didn't answer. And in that not answering, in that small, dignified silence she chose because she had no other option, every person in that living room understood exactly what had happened. I want to tell you something. I did not say a single word during any of this. I stood by the dining room with Aunt Maris, and I let Bob Halvorson do what my mother had paid him to do. I was 7 years old when she paid him. I was 35 years old when he showed up to do it. 30 years, almost to the month. The math of love. Have you ever had someone in your family try to rewrite who you are to make themselves look better? Tell me in the comments below. I'm going to read everyone. What happened over the next 3 months happened mostly without me. That is the part that has stayed with me. I did not have to lift a finger. Bob Halvorson filed a civil suit on behalf of the trust against Joanne Ardmore for conversion of trust property, which is the legal term for taking something that isn't yours. The damages they sought were not just the value of what she had sold, which turned out to be about $1,200 in ticketed items. The damages were also the value of what she had burned. My mother's wedding dress, the photograph albums, the recipe box, the hope chest. Items with sentimental value can be assigned monetary value in court when they're trust property and a written inventory exists, which my mother, God bless her, had prepared in 1996. The hearing was in early February at the Hancock County Courthouse on State Street. I went. I sat in the second row in a navy dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, and I watched Bob Halvorson, in his too big gray suit and his brown loafers, present my mother's inventory page by page. He read out every item: the Pyrex casserole dish from the 1985 bridal shower, the hand-knit afghan made by my grandmother Adele in 1972, the pale blue silk scarf originally purchased in 1976 from a department store in Indianapolis, given to my mother by her own mother on her 30th birthday. The wedding dress, custom altered by a seamstress in Knightstown named Mrs. Ophelia Voss. Joanne sat at the defendant's table next to a public defender she'd had to scrape up. She did not look at me. Not once. She kept her eyes on the table and her hands folded like a child in detention. The judge ruled in 2 hours. The court awarded the trust $84,000 in damages. $84,000 for items most people would have thrown into a Goodwill bag. Because a teacher in Greenfield, Indiana, had taken the time in 1996 to write down the provenance of every dish and every dress, and because that teacher had paid an attorney to keep that inventory in a folder for 30 years, and because the items, when added up, were not just dishes and dresses, but a record of a woman's life. Joanne did not have $84,000. She had not worked since 2003. She had been living on my father's pension and Social Security. The judge ordered a lien against any future inheritance she might receive from her own family in Marion County, and she ended up declaring bankruptcy in late March. The Greenfield Daily Reporter ran a small notice of it on page 7 in a font so small you have to be looking for it. People were looking for it. That was the first thing. The second thing was Cody. Cody came to see me 3 weeks after the sale. He drove up from Cincinnati on a Sunday afternoon in his work truck, a red Ford F-150 with the magnetic sign for his HVAC company on the door. He sat at my kitchen table in Indianapolis, and he wrapped his hands around a Pyrex coffee mug, the same chipped one I always use. And he said, "Whitney, I'm so sorry. I should have said something years ago. I knew she was throwing things out. I knew she was lying about it." He cried, which was a thing I had never seen Cody do in 23 years. He told me he had stopped speaking to his mother. He told me he wasn't going to bring his kids around her anymore. He told me he would not have understood what kind of woman she was if Bob Halvorson had not walked into that estate sale and laid out the inventory on the cash box. He said, "Mom always told me you were just dramatic about the things going missing. She always said you exaggerated. I believed her, Whit. I'm sorry." I said, "I know. I'm not angry at you, Cody." He said, "Why aren't you angry at me?" I said, "Because you were a kid too. We were both kids." He said, "That's a more generous answer than I deserve." I said, "It's not. It's just the answer." He sat for a while looking at the steam coming off the coffee. Then he said, "Whit, can I ask you something? The dress. Mom's wedding dress story. About Goodwill. Was that real?" I said, "It wasn't her wedding dress, Cody. It was my mother's wedding dress. And no, I don't think it ever made it to Goodwill. I think she burned it years ago and lied about it." He closed his eyes. He said, "Yeah, that's what I figured." He hugged me before he left. "We're not close. We may never be close. But there's a kind of repair you can do without becoming family, and I think we did it." The third thing was the church. Joanne had built her whole social life at First Methodist on Main Street. She was on the prayer chain. She volunteered for the bake sales. She had stood in the front pew at my father's funeral, and people had told her how strong she was. The story of the estate sale, and especially the story of the burning, which Mrs. Ferguson told to two friends, who told it to two more friends, who told it to the pastor's wife, moved through that prayer chain like a low fever. I want to tell you something specific about how that prayer chain worked, because it matters. The prayer chain at First Methodist was not gossip exactly, it was concern wearing a kind face. Women would call each other and say, "I just wanted to lift up Joanne in prayer because she's been going through such a hard time, and I heard the strangest thing about the estate sale." That was the form. By February, every woman who had ever made Joanne a casserole knew that she had burned a dying woman's wedding dress. By February, Joanne was eating Sunday dinner alone. The casseroles stopped showing up. The phone calls stopped coming. The Lions Club ladies stopped inviting her to bunco night. The pastor's wife, a kind woman named Mrs. A. Linda Whitaker, made one careful visit in late February and sat with Joanne at the kitchen table for 40 minutes. She told me about the visit later, at a coffee shop on East Main. She said, "Whitney, I went to listen. I went hoping she would say she was sorry. She didn't. She said you'd taken everything from her. She said your father had loved her best at the end. She didn't mention the burning." Mrs. Whitaker stirred her coffee. She said, "I love this church. I love that woman, in the way I'm called to love everybody. But I could not in good conscience keep including her in things after that conversation. Some things have to mean something." Nobody confronted Joanne. Nobody made a speech. They just stopped. I was not happy about that. I want you to know I was not happy. I have spent enough time around dying people to know that being shunned by your community at 65 years old is one of the worst things that can happen to a person. I felt sorry for her. I really did. But I also could not undo what she did, and I could not pretend it hadn't happened. And the church ladies of Greenfield, Indiana, had decided what they had decided. Joanne called me in March. It was the first time we had spoken since Saturday afternoon at the estate sale. She left a voicemail. Her voice was very thin. She said, "Whitney, sweetie, I I think I owe you an apology. I'd like to talk." I called her back. I did not feel triumphant. I want you to understand that. I was not pumping my fist. I was tired. I was 35 years old, and I had spent 23 years watching this woman move my mother out of my house piece by piece, and I had finally watched her sit alone in that house, and there was nothing in me that wanted to gloat. I said, "Joanne, hi, it's Whitney." She said, "Whitney, I want you to know I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to start fresh. I didn't think your mother's things meant that much to you. I thought you'd be relieved." I said, "Joanne, I have to go." She said, "Wait, sweetie, can we have lunch? Can we just—" I said, "Joanne, I don't think we can. I don't have anything to say to you. I'm not angry. I'm just tired. I hope you're okay." I hung up. I cried for about 10 minutes. Not for her. For the version of me at 12 who had watched her box up my mother's clothes and didn't know how to fight her on it. A month after the bankruptcy filing, Joanne moved in with her sister in Anderson, about 30 miles away. The house on Mulberry Drive, my house technically since June, sat empty for a few weeks while I figured out what to do with it. I drove down on a Saturday with Aunt Maris and we walked through it room by room. The smell of smoke had finally lifted. The hutch was empty. The walls were beige. The dining room wallpaper my mother had picked out in 1992 was long gone. I want to tell you what I did. I had an estate restoration company come in and assess what could be cleaned, what could be repaired, and what could be returned. The china that had been on the dining room table on Saturday. Mrs. Ferguson and 3 other neighbors brought back the pieces they'd bought, refused refunds, and set them on my kitchen counter like it was the most natural thing in the world. The Pyrex casserole came home. The Afghan came home. A handful of photographs, scorched at the edges but recoverable, came home. Mrs. Ferguson had scooped them out of the burn barrel that Tuesday afternoon when Joanne went inside to use the bathroom, because Mrs. Ferguson, I have learned, is the kind of woman who notices when her neighbor is burning her dead friend's wedding album in the backyard, and she does not look away. I had the dining room repainted. Pale yellow with a small blue floral border around the ceiling, as close as we could get to the wallpaper my mother had picked out in 1992. I put the salvaged photographs in new frames. I hung my parents' wedding photo from 1985 back over the fireplace. I put the recipe card for my grandmother's chicken and noodles back on the front of the recipe box, where Mrs. Pretty Ferguson had also somehow managed to save it. I am not going to live in that house. I have an apartment in Indianapolis that I love, but I am going to keep it. I'm going to keep it the way my mother kept that Bible. Because some things are not for using. Some things are for remembering. Peace doesn't come from revenge. It comes from standing on something solid and knowing you built your life on it. My mother built mine. In April of 1995, when I was 6 years old and she was already sick, she drove herself to Indianapolis and hired Bob Halvorson and signed a trust agreement. And she did it because she knew. She knew she was going to die, and she knew my father was going to grieve himself into the arms of the wrong woman, and she knew that woman was going to try to erase her. And my mother, quiet second-grade teacher, green felt pen, Eleanor Ardmore, refused to be erased. Real love does not test you to prove you deserve it. Real love plans for you. Real love hires a lawyer in 1995 and asks him to keep your photograph on his desk for 30 years. Sometimes the people who protect you aren't the ones standing in front of you. Sometimes they planned for you years ago. I tell one of these stories every night. I sit in my apartment in Indianapolis with a cup of coffee in a chipped Pyrex mug, and I write them out and I read them to whoever's listening. Some nights I wonder if anyone out there is hearing me. Then I read the comments and I find out somebody in Reno or Tulsa or Roanoke heard exactly what they needed to hear, and I keep going. There's no shortage of these stories. That's the saddest part of all of this. If you could protect one thing in your life, a place, a person, a promise, what would it be? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, the one on your screen right now is for you. It's about a clinical psychologist whose narcissist husband spent 8 years convincing everyone she was losing her mind, and the voice memos she'd been quietly recording the whole time. Tap the card. I'll see you there.